Hello.
Yeah, welcome to our steroid panel.
Hi, everyone. Great to be back again for our second evening on a row. Um, uh, Welcome to everyone from around the world, from the UK and from Australia. And it's very much a sort of a split um, site event for this particular session, isn't it, Katinka?
Yeah, it really is.
And should I run through what you're gonna get over the next hour and a half? Um, Basically, I'm going to give a quick background for this session around setting the scene. Should we be concerned about anabolic androgenic steroids? Are they a public health issue? As the session is around the challenges for harm reduction, should we even be addressing this issue? We then go over to Jeff Bates, and he'll be looking at some research he's been doing around systems mapping to try and understand the decisions that people make which can influence harmful use. Unfortunately, Ingrid Havness, who was going to be presenting this evening, she's unable to attend. I'm sure you join me in your thoughts to her. Unfortunately, her father's unwell. So from Jeff, we'll go to meet Mair Underwood, a researcher in Australia, and she'll be introducing and chatting to Dave Crosland, and I won't even try to introduce him. He can do that for himself. Then we'll go to Katinka, and Katinka will be talking about anabolic steroid use in primary care. And then we'll be opening up to questions for all the speakers in a sort of panel discussion. So please start off with your questions as you think of them. Send them in. And if I pass over to you, Katinka, for anything that you want to add.
Well, I was just thinking that we haven't introduced ourselves yet, so we might want to say something about that. Jim, do you want to introduce yourself first, and I will go after you?
Okay, yeah. My name is Jim McVeigh. I'm a professor in substance use and associated behaviour at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. I've been, well, you'll see how long I've been, I was going to say messing about, I should say, doing research around anabolic steroids. And that's sort of what I'll be reflecting on in my presentation. What about you, Katinka?
Well, let's hope that today I get my affiliation right. But I'm a senior lecturer at the criminology department at the University of New England. And I'm also a visiting fellow at the drugs policy modeling program at the University of New South Wales. I'm the editor-in-chief of Performance Enhancement and Health. And I'm also the director of the Human Enhancement Drugs Network. And I do a lot of research around the use and supply of enhancement drugs and its regulation as well. I have to say it is mainly focused on anabolic steroids, the research that I conduct. So we will be chairing the steroid panel today, which I'm really excited about.
Great. If it's okay, I'll make a start if we can have the slides up, please.
Perfect.
Thank you. And I suppose what I should have also said is that I helped establish the Anabolic Steroids UK network, which is a network of academics, practitioners, and people who use anabolic steroids who have a desire to influence harm reduction in relation to the use of substances. So what I'll be doing is looking at an overview of something I've been doing for a number of years, and it's basically in the early 90s when I first started working with Pat Lenihan at the Drugs and Sport Information Service. We put on a conference, and it was asking the question, what are the public health implications of anabolic steroid use, and sort of framed it for the first time that we were aware of looking at it through the issue through a public health lens. And we're still doing that now, really. We need to decide, and if we do decide it's a public health issue, what do we do about that? So the first stage are what are the criteria? What criteria does it have to fill to be classed as a public health issue? What is the available evidence? And I suppose also, what has our understanding improved over time? And it may seem like it's an obvious point that, the more research that's done, the more papers that are published, obviously we've got a better understanding, but it doesn't always necessarily follow that way. Obviously, the information increases, but sometimes our appreciation isn't always linear, shall we say. So in the last few years, I've worked with a group of other academics in the UK, and we've done published extensively around the evidence base. That most recently, this piece of work, which was looking at the published literature for the last 5 years in the UK, looking at what particular topics are looked at and what is missed. Jeff Bates, who we'll be hearing from later, I have to give credit to in many ways around this, giving. Jeff works very well on making complicated, messy things understandable, and he managed to do that on a number of issues for me, at least for the period it took me to write stuff down. So I'm grateful to him in helping me construct what I've been doing in relation to identifying anabolic steroid use as a public health issue. So what the first thing I did was, and this goes back to the 1990s, was identify what are the categories that we need to look at to assess whether it's a public health issue. And with broad categories around epidemiology, so the extent, the nature of characteristics and demographics of people who use, why they actually using, how they're using substances, what are those associated harms, and what are the responses. And from that, I was able to sort of tease out specific headings for assessing that information. As I say, it's not linear. It's not. We haven't steadily got a better understanding necessarily over time. In some cases, we've just identified that things were far more complex than we previously understood. And I'll try and explain what I mean. In relation to prevalence, for instance, we've never really had a good handle on, say, what the prevalence of, how many people use anabolic steroids. There's a lot of research takes place in hardcore gyms, and you go into a gym with a load of steroid users and you come out with a prevalence estimate that, lots of people use steroids, but obviously that doesn't give you a true prevalence. It just tells you where there's a concentration of steroid users. I think in recent years, and I suppose, as I've indicated on the decades there, I mean, it gets even more sad than this. I used to do this on an annual basis, but I've managed to wean myself off to just do it every 10 years and do this snapshot and assessment. So we have improved it, and the likes of Dominic Sago and his work helped. But while his metasynthesis and meta-analysis was very robust, it relies on the strength of the studies that he analysed, and there's an awful lot of weak studies, so it gives very large error margins. So when he says 3% may have used, there's a huge sort of range that are on either side of that. In relation to characteristics, I mean, this is one where we thought we had a good handle on it. Certainly in the 1990s, where we were doing a lot of work with anabolic steroid users who are either presenting to needle and syringe programs or in hardcore gyms, many of whom were working on the door. Certainly many of them had aspirations to bodybuilding, if not engaged in bodybuilding. And we thought that we'd really sort of increased our understanding. And it's probably in the last 10 years that we've gained an appreciation really that there's a lot broader spectrum of users out there, and I think Ask Quest Christian's work did valuable work around that to highlight this the typologies and the range of different types of users. We know that there's women using, we know that there's much wider age range than previously, and certainly that the media will portray. Research we've been involved in shown that there's as many people over the age of 40 as there are under 25, in a number of studies. So, it's not just that caricature of the Love Island generation. It's many people who are engaged in a form of testosterone replacement therapy or self-management. Tied into that characteristics of use, of users is the reasons for use. And again, we thought we knew about it, but obviously with the different characteristics, there's different reasons why people use. And again, we're only just starting to get an understanding of that. We're starting to reconsider around how people are using. Certainly, we had a firm belief that, and still to a large extent is true, that the vast majority of users use injection. But certainly there's a population out there who are just using orally, and we know very little about them in many circumstances. One area that we have got a strong understanding and has improved over time is in relation to harms. And I think in particular, those long-term chronic harms, cardiovascular disease, prolonged hypergonadism, so that shutdown of testicular function, and the evidence emerging from Norway around changes to brain structure and function, and we're starting to get a better understanding around that. But as we discussed last night, talking about human enhancement drugs, it's no good just talking about the harms. And I've used the term efficacy, but in some ways it's linked into that the rationale why people use it and the pleasure, whether the pleasure is immediate or whether it's delayed through the benefits and the gains that people will get. But we have very weak information about efficacy. We know from the studies in the 1990s that anabolic steroids do work, but most of the research is centered around a couple of different forms of testosterone. We certainly don't know what optimal dosages are. We don't know what combinations are most effective. We don't know what the impact, the potential benefits or otherwise of a vast repertoire of drugs. So it's the flip side of the harms, that we're not able to provide an evidence base in support of efficacy. There's a strong base there amongst people who use these substances and a common understanding. But really, to be able to serve that population as academics, we need that robust evidence to be able to support it. And the best information we can get is quite often that anecdotal or secondhand reports from the community themselves. When it comes to effective responses, that's where the real weaknesses are. In relation to treatment, we've got some early work that's coming out of Scandinavia around support for those people looking to cease use. And this will happen for many people who choose to use anabolic steroids. A time will come when they'll wish to stop using. How do we effectively support and manage that? For prevention or the delaying the onset, we have no evidence. We have some that may be transferable from other drugs, but we don't really have an evidence base around, what do we say to somebody who may be going on a first cycle, and we know they're not training properly. We know that they could get benefits through other means. We don't have an evidence base to support that. And for harm reduction, again, we have some generalizable issues around, in particular, blood-borne viruses. But in particular in the case of where we don't know what the actual substances are that people are using because of the illicit market, we have a very weak evidence base. So that was really what I wanted to emphasize, that while we've had research going on for many years, we're still at a very early stage of really understanding, and in particular moving on to identifying how we respond to this challenge. I think, yes, it is a public health issue, and we've got enough evidence to support that, but we don't have sufficient evidence yet to really go about providing robust interventions and guaranteeing that we don't generate unintended consequences. So that's really all I wanted to mention at the beginning of this, and I'll hand back to Katinka.
Thank you so much. We'll now have a great presentation of Jeff.
Thanks, Katinka. Yeah, I'll start sharing my slides now. I always get a bit nervous when Jim says nice things about me, because it usually means I'm going to get an email at about 3 in the morning asking me to do some additional work. So I'll wait to see what's there in the morning when I wake up. Okay, so I will. Yeah, so I'm going to pick up on some of the things that Jim was talking about there, his ideas of unintended consequences, how we can respond to some of these these public health issues. And this is based on a piece of work that I did with Jim and other colleagues from the here in the UK, that tried to understand influences on what we call harmful anabolic steroid use. So recognize that steroid use can lead to harm, and that harm varies a lot for different people in different times. So we did some work to try and understand that harm and think about how it links with well, where it sits really within harm reduction. So specifically we looked at what are the most important factors that increase or reduce risk of harms amongst people who use steroids, and then putting that in the context of what's currently being delivered in terms of interventions and harm reduction approaches, and thinking about what might we do to try and improve, widen the scope, I suppose, of harm reduction and better respond to harms. Just wanted to quickly touch upon this idea of systems thinking, because I know not everybody will likely be familiar with it, and this is the approach that we used in this study to try and help just look at this issue in a different way, I suppose. So systems thinking is broadly, it's useful for understanding it and thinking about complex behaviours, complex areas of health in different ways. And we'd think of steroid use as a complex behaviour for all the reasons that Jim was just talking about, really, the complexity within the population, and the fact that there's just so many different factors that we think influence the decisions that people make and the experiences they have, including their experience of harm. So systems thinking is it's not a new method, but it's becoming new and more used within the public health field to understand these complex behaviours. So it's often used to look at mental health, physical activity, and obesity. There's different areas of complexity, and to try and unpick them and to better understand them, in order to better intervene and to design policies and interventions and services that perhaps better reflect needs. And so the specific approach we used was based around what's called systems mapping work. Systems mapping involves identifying the factors within what we call this wider system that can be people, it can be social groups, it could be individual level factors, so different actors, different people, different influences, thinking about how they relate to harm in our case, and how these different factors connect to one another. And then systems mapping is specifically just producing a visual output that represents what we think this system looks like. And we based our mapping on some reviews of the evidence that we did as a research group over the past few years. And then also we held a couple of workshops earlier this year with 18 stakeholders who represented different experience, expertise relating to steroid use, and sort of academics, people with lived experience, practitioners, clinicians, policymakers, and got them to sort of help us to develop this map based on what we think influences is harm. And so together we included, we identified these 51 distinct factors that influence harm, or the kind of, we identified more, but we focused on the ones that seem to be most important to try and keep the mess of this sort of messy system to a minimum. And we grouped these factors within 9 overall domains. That's a really quick introduction to the study in terms of what we did and how we did it. It's obviously a lot more detail, but I wanted to use the time to sort of talk through the map that we came up with and these sort of where we think sort of these influences on harm are. This is where the tech could fail me, but I'm hoping it won't. So this, here we go. So this is the map that we came up with. It's produced in this software that I'm always worried I'm going to make a mess of, but I'll just zoom out to start with, just so to give an overall picture of it. I appreciate you won't be able to see the detail here. This is it as a whole. I think immediately it does look a bit messy. Jim helpfully bigged me up before this, didn't he, by saying that I'm good at explaining messy mess and kind of making sense of it. Well, this will be a test of that, because I think when you first view something like this, and this is often the case with these sort of systems maps, that they can look a little bit sort of messy, overwhelming, and hard to kind of see the detail, I suppose, without kind of getting bogged down in some of the lines and all the different colors on there. Just a bit of an explanation. The different colors represent the different domains, which are the different kind of groups of similar sorts of factors. So they're there, so you can see the different colors. There's 9 of them, and these sort of bold headings represent the titles of those domains. And I'll talk you through them and kind of pick out some of the more interesting factors and the implications for harm reduction. I'll start up at the top, which I think is a logical place to start. Before I go into the detail, just to explain the arrows on here, we use 2 types of arrows in this map. You can see them here, these the thick arrows with the plus signs. These represent sort of positive relationships between 2 different factors within our map. So in this example, we felt that as sort of health professional knowledge and engagement skills increase, then sort of exposure in the IPA community to regulated advice and information, so evidence-based messages, is likely to increase as well. The other type relationship, if I did an example, so one like this, represented by a dotted arrow with a minus sign, as you can probably work out, represents a negative or sort of opposite connection, where, so in this case, as online provision of injecting equipment goes up, we suspect that access to services may be reduced, and so exposure to information and advice from health professionals in this case may be decreased. And I should say that these connections, we didn't attempt to validate them or quantify them at all. There's methods you use to do that, but this was just based on our stakeholders and the evidence, what that tells us about the relationship between these factors. So I wanted to start with this portion of our map with these 3 factors here, this sort of the brown, yellow, and grey ones, which kind of, I think it's a logical place to start, because these themes will be familiar to those who are kind of familiar with the harm reduction discussion in the UK, but also elsewhere, because they broadly relate to service provision, access to healthcare, and engagement with services and health professionals. So in the UK, we have a strong focus over here on sort of bloodborne virus prevention. It's a priority for us within our sort of harm reduction strategy, and we talked a lot about how that can sort of affect harm in various ways. Yes, it increases accessibility to injecting equipment, which we recognise is very important, but also potentially sort of to the detriment of the need to provide, or the sort of the desire to provide, other interventions. And so that has sort of potentially knock-on effects for how people who use steroids think about how attractive it is to actually attend support services. Is that enough of an incentive to want to go? So some ideas were around sort of, well, how can we actually and this fits with some of the other literature that's come out in the last couple of years that kind of makes this point as well, saying that actually, can we provide just a wider range of interventions, make services more attractive to people, and increase engagement. It also raises the issue of people who don't engage and how we can reach them with some of the sort of the advice and information and interventions we might want to give. Other factors to affect beliefs about services. So these sort of yellow theme, the beliefs about healthcare. So sort of issues around trust in health professionals, willingness to disclose iPad use to health professionals, and an experience that people have when they do engage with healthcare. And that then relates to sort of these health professional factors. And so we talk a lot about how sort of the knowledge, engagement skills, attitudes of health professionals perhaps might influence desire to engage and re-engage with services. And in terms of interventions, and I know that it sounded like from her introduction that Katinka might talk about this later in terms of kind of how you can perhaps improve some of these factors within health professionals through sort of training and guidance, which always comes up as kind of a substantial gap in our current approaches for kind of increasing engagement. Because we haven't got that much time, I'm not going to go into all of these, but I did just highlight this sort of the pink theme here around health and well-being. I think it's interesting that they're complex factors. I think the actual sort of, they're quite hard to represent, I think, in some ways on this map. It's probably the area that when we were building the map was hardest to kind of unpick. I think the key points are that obviously health changes, including how you experience harm and health changes relating to lots of these other factors. So they're important to think about. It's not just kind of an outcome from steroid use. The health kind of influences how people experience lots of these other factors that are within the map, and there's lots of interesting connections to other portions of it. And lots of discussions here around how you can sort of increase engagement again with health professionals, how you can improve health professionals or support them to better identify symptoms and potential adverse effects, to help them to identify iPad use. Improving access to endocrinologists and just mental health support in general, as a sort of an area that perhaps doesn't get so much focus. As I go towards the middle, it starts to look a lot messier. And that's simply because of the number of connections that these three sort of central themes around identity, beliefs about risk and harm, and cognitive processes, how many connections were identified within the themes and also to the other themes within this map as well. I think that in terms of beliefs about risk and harm, this is probably one of the more well-recognized areas. And we can think about how we can better sort of influence knowledge and attitudes through information provision, which is often a kind of a focus of interventions. But it's potentially not something that we do very well in reaching people who use steroids. And again, outside of our health services, what ways do we really have of trying to reach people with good quality and kind of evidence-based messages and information? And then one of the areas I find most interesting is this in the purple, these sort of cognitive processes. I think that these factors around kind of how we actually process information, how we think about advice we might get, or images we see, and norms and values. And so these kind of issues around kind of critical thinking skills and how they relate to other cognitive processes, what factors from outside might affect critical thinking. And what was quite interesting was our stakeholders talked a lot about this in terms of how can we tackle these factors, thinking about sort of improving critical thinking skills and doing things like kind of bias awareness and media critique. And they talked about this from kind of a school-based interventions. So not kind of what we often think of as sort of prevention approaches, but these sort of harm-reducing interventions from an earlier age to kind of build these skills, and so that when for later that they're better sort of equipped perhaps to make decisions that take into account these sort of issues that can be quite powerful influences on how we think. Again, just to touch on this identity theme, I think that sort of similar factors in this around sort of, I don't know, body awareness, expectations around body, drive to improve self, and how these factors link to some of the other areas on the map around beliefs and around cognitive processes. But I think what's interesting is that it's nice to say that these aren't all negative factors. Where you're looking at sort of, I don't know, this sense of belonging, for example, as a factor, and how that potentially can lead on to sort of to bias perhaps how we think about information, but also how it can have really sort of positive impacts for how people experience sort of mental well-being and sort of feeling positive about oneself. And it's just an example of perhaps of the kind of the complexity involved in some of this, and how not all of these are factors that you want to necessarily reduce and change without thinking about what some of the unintended consequences, as Jim was mentioning earlier, might be of doing that. At the bottom, we have these sort of social environments. So the kind of these social factors, social groups, the settings and ways that people talk about and receive information and advice about steroid use. A big focus was on this issue of kind of normalization of steroid use, and this idea that as perhaps steroids become more acceptable, they become more normalized, and how that potentially influences the amount of information that's out there. And that information isn't always of good quality, that it can be. It might be well intended, but not necessarily. And so lots of sort of links here with interestingly, potentially with sort of this idea of stigma. And again, just pointed out that, yes, we might think that reducing normalization of iPads could be a positive thing, but it also could have negatives, such as by sort of increasing stigma. So again, the unintended consequences being something to think about. Some of these factors are a little bit more around, kind of more towards perhaps iPad use in general and steroid use in general, rather than just around harms, but they link into these other factors. So by kind of increasing prevalence, increasing acceptability around steroids, that can link in with some of these other factors that are perhaps more associated with harm. And then finally, because I probably need to stop in a minute, but this kind of nice turquoisey colour representing the iPad's market here on the right. And this is where it's sort of interesting just to point out, it links in with issues around policy and legislation. So, for example, in the UK, sort of restrictions on importing iPads, and how that was felt to have kind of changed where and how steroids were manufactured. And that might link to the quality of iPads, and how perhaps potential kind of policy and legislative changes can influence the quality of steroids that people are using, how that links back into the ability to sort of to manage risk and harm in the context of this kind of uncertain and sort of dynamic market. If I just zoom out to finish, so that to get the whole picture again, and just with the kind of that kind of overarching thoughts, really just being that I think that what I found useful with this is that it helps demonstrate the complexity, I think, involved in thinking about the harms related to iPad use. And that I think what it really highlights to me is that our current harm reduction approaches are only tackling a small part of this picture. Yes, we focus a lot on bloodborne virus prevention. We focus a bit around sort of information provision to change sort of beliefs. There's a lot of this that our current approaches don't really touch upon, and so lots of room for additional interventions and sort of really sort of improving the way that we respond to risks and harms. I will finish there, because otherwise I'll end up waffling. But hopefully that was helpful and into an introduction to our map.
Thank you, Jeff. You didn't fail to. You managed to deliver a very sort of complex issues in an accessible way, which is what we really wanted. I suppose what people might not fully appreciate is the process and how over time that evolved and grew in complexity, and it's going to be a really useful tool, I think, to explore issues going forward. So thanks very much for that, and I'm sure to generate questions. I'll move on to our next speaker or speakers, and I'm going to introduce someone else who's had a big influence on my work in recent years, and that's Dr. Mair Underwood. And she, in a very gentle way, challenged me and challenged my areas of comfort around public health surveillance, and by putting forward very articulate and direct way her experiences within the communities of enhanced bodybuilders. And maybe if you could take a few minutes before introducing Dave to just tell us a bit about that work, because it's fascinating, the work that you do, and makes a real contribution to what we're discussing today.
Oh, thanks very much for the talk, Jim. I really am glad that I was able to shift Jim's perspective on this issue a little bit. The reason I have is because I come from a very different background to Jim. I'm an anthropologist. I've spent the last 7 years hanging out with bodybuilders online, the last 5 years specifically in enhancement communities. And as an anthropologist, I suppose I'm focused on different areas of that systems map that Jeff just presented. I'm more interested in the social environment and in identity, and particularly in harm reduction as it is practiced within the drug using community. And I'm really interested in the opportunities that we have to support bodybuilders in their harm reduction practice. So I'm really interested in what they're doing already and how we can sort of combine pool efforts rather than us going off on what we think is important and the people who use the drugs going off in a different direction. I'd really like to sort of bridge that divide. So during my work in this community, I've been very lucky to establish a relationship with Mr. Dave Crosland, who I'm going to be talking to today, having a bit of a conversation about harm reduction from the community perspective. Now, Dave is a former enhancement drug user himself, and the fact that he's sort of moved past that for himself, I think, affords him a bit more of an objective perspective than some members of the community who are currently in the thick of use have. He has a reputation for taking large amounts of these drugs, but also a reputation as being an expert on their use. He's recognised by the British courts, by the Defence Force and the police, etc., as an expert in image and performance enhancing drug use. He also provides harm reduction services for people who use image and performance enhancing drugs. He gives advice online to users. He meets with users or people who use these drugs. He has a blood testing company that provides health monitoring for people who use these drugs. He's also a coach and a trainer. So not only does he have his personal experience, but he has a wealth of knowledge from working across the community with a whole range of people who use image and performance enhancing drugs. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dave Crosland.
Hello. Thank you for
you
that
got big boots to fill now.
Very long introduction. I'll give you the money later.
Now you got to live up to my talking now, okay? And I should have said Dave also has a tendency to ramble. So if I do interject and cut him off, I have his permission to do that. So I'm going to try and keep him in line during this conversation. Okay, so I think we agree, Dave, that the biggest issue is, as Jeff said, that the hard to reachness of this population. The biggest issue is the sort of trust and engagement of people who use image and performance enhancing drugs with health professionals and with scientists. Can you talk to me a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, there is a wide range of users and there is a wide range of health recognition within users. There is a strong movement in certain areas of usage towards health and towards managing health, and a lot of users do take self-responsibility. But there is obviously a large community that does not as well and are just following what their mate told them to do. But what is uniform across the board is a strong mistrust of what they see as governmental medical services. And this includes needle exchange programs, GPs. There is a large amount, particularly in the UK, I believe Australia's got similar problems as well from previous conversations we've had and things we've done together, of medical bias or medical prejudice against users. Now, this is a real thing. It does happen. This isn't a criticism of medical services. It's just the fact that they just aren't aware of the choices for use, the reasons behind use, and how users operate or what their thought processes are, because they're never educated on it. So, I mean, you can give loads of examples, but it's not particularly relevant to today. But there is deep mistrust, and as a result, there is a growing private sector to supply users with harm reduction services. There are now several dedicated companies within the UK that specialize in working with users.
Now I'm going to come back to that issue of the harm reduction that's already occurring in the community, but I just want to sort of talk about the reasons for the lack of trust and engagement with health professionals. From what I can tell, there is the stigma that people who use image performance enhancing drugs face often from health professionals. As you say, a lot of them don't understand the reasons for use. I don't think we have the same empathy for people who use these drugs as we might for, say, a woman who's using dieting pills in an extreme way, or who is suffering with body image issues. I think we, as a culture, have more empathy for women suffering these issues than we do men, and that perhaps, you know, it's a sort of perhaps a bit of a gender bias in that we, and also maybe just a sort of element of our history. We're not used to men being concerned with their bodies in the same way that we are women. So I think you're right. I think there is a stigma. I think there's a lack of understanding of this particular group. I think in part it is because, as Jeff and Jim were talking, there is a lack of science to inform sort of health provision. But I think there is also an ignorance. There is a sort of unwillingness, at least by some health professionals, to understand these issues. Can you talk more about the reasons for the lack of trust and lack of engagement?
I think one of the biggest problems is that when a user admits to a professional that they've got a health problem or they're experiencing negative effects from the drugs they're using, the health professional's general stock answer is stop using. Now, we're seeing more and more evidence about addiction associated with steroid use. There's definitely psychological dependence. I was even having a conversation with a lad today who is absolutely terrified of just reducing his dose, let alone coming off. And many associate their self-worth with their physique and their drug use as they get further down the line and well into using. So when a professional turns around and say, stop using, they might as well tell them to end their lives as far as they're concerned. It's just not something that's their option. And so they'll generally get, stop using and that will fix the problem, which is probably perfectly viable, but it's not an acceptable response to the user. They wouldn't turn around to someone who was addicted to heroin and say, stop using it will solve the problem, or someone who had a problem with cocaine or alcohol or any other substance misuse. There is a support network in place but not particularly in anabolics. You get the ridiculous scenarios where doctors just have a very poor knowledge of the effects of the drugs. Some of it's historic, some of it's bro science type stuff, and they'll just give ridiculous answers. But there's also concern that if a user admits usage to a medical professional, that it will then enter their record. And then as a result, any subsequent problems will be dismissed because they've admitted being a user. I've experienced this personally, where I have literally been sat in a hospital bed and dismissed because I use steroids. Unfortunately, the incident I was dealing with, I hadn't used steroid for a period of time before that instance. There was no relation, but because there was a record I had admitted in previous record that I'd used, it was automatically assumed that my problem was steroid associated, without even looking to see what the problem was effectively. So there's that element. Because we sit in a very unique legal situation in the UK, there is also genuine concern that if the true numbers are known of users, that will push legislation forward. There is concern of insurance being null and void because of admittance of steroid use for a medical professional. So there's all sorts of little bits that tack on to that as well. But in general, the mistrust is based around the poor quality of information received from medical professionals.
Yes, I've come across similar things. I mean, here in Australia, we've got a very different sort of policy around use. And for example, where I live in Queensland, steroids are a Schedule 1 drug equivalent to heroin. So you can understand a sort of reluctance to perhaps divulge that information to a health professional. I've spoken to guys in the US who are very worried about their health insurance being impacted by divulging this sort of information. I do think that in large part, the lack of information, of quality information provided by health professionals is because they are limited in what they can advise. They can only give advice that is backed by science, and we don't have the science. But I think there's also a history of distrust in the community, perhaps with good reason, because there was for a long time a denial by the scientific community that these drugs were actually effective. Then there's been an overstatement of the risks and harms of these drugs. And there's also been in-service provision, what a lot of people who use image and performance enhancing drugs would say was an inappropriate focus in harm reduction efforts. The focus on bloodborne virus, not saying that this is not an issue in the community, and particularly in certain segments of the IPED community. But for a lot of people who use image and performance enhancing drugs, there are other priorities that need to be discussed over bloodborne virus. Am I right?
BBV is not particularly a concern of the mass majority of the user groups. There are certain specific user groups involved with their other lifestyle where it's more, that's why they're exposed to risk, though the steroid use does come into that to an extent. I mean, I've been around steroids for 25, 30 years, longer, 31, 32, 31 years. I've never known anyone contract a BBV. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because obviously it does. We've got stats that show it does. That commonplace. What I think as well is an issue is that, like you say, medical professionals, because of science, because of understanding, are very limited to what they can do that's effective for a user. If I go to my doctor because I have suppressed testosterone production because I've used anabolics, I'm unlikely to get testosterone replacement therapy because I've suppressed it myself. But I'm also very unlikely to get any support in helping to recover my natural testosterone, commonly referred to as a PCT, because it means using drugs outside of what they're at this point designated for use, off script. And so a lot of users will look at medical services and say, well, they haven't got anything practical to give me. The downside of that is because users don't admit uses to medical services, we don't develop a picture of what harms are being reported that may be associated with anabolic use, because nobody's going to the doctor with a ducky heart and saying, oh yeah, but I've been using steroids for 10 years. So that's just someone with a heart problem. It's not someone that may have a heart problem associated with use. So we have this real twisted stats then on how many people engaging with medical services are actually doing so, maybe not entirely, but in association with their anabolic use. And it just pushes. I mean, I'm now seeing private sector companies offering ECGs, offering echoes, and all sorts of getting into quite serious, investigatory medicine as a private service for users, because some are that willing to pay that price in order to manage their health and be able to continue with their usage. And that's the driving thing. It's the continuation of use that they want to manage. They're not interested in stopping. They're interested in continuing use, but minimizing the risks they pose to themselves.
I think that's a really important point, that we tend to approach image and performance enhancing drug users as risk takers, but if a large proportion, and some of them do seem to use in a reckless manner. There's as you said, a wide variety of people who use these drugs, but a lot of them, and you can probably talk to me about this, there has been a shift, as what's called I've seen called in the forums, the age of enlightenment in bodybuilding, and a shift towards science-based practice and health monitoring in the last few decades. And there are a lot of concerned users who really want to monitor their health, to take the appropriate ancillary drugs to counteract some of the side effects of the drugs that they're using. And as you say, they cannot go to a health professional for this support. So within the community, we are seeing, crowd funded blood testing labs. We're seeing people like yourself testing the gear itself, providing blood testing services so you can see what is, out of a healthy range in your blood work, these sort of things. So I see this as a great opportunity to start bridging the divide between health professionals and the community of users. But we need to come together and collaborate on this.
Yeah, it's a very separate effort, and often in certain cases it pulls in separate ways. And I do think there is definitely a good step forward would be a greater integration between user community, private sector, and public sector when it comes to health. Over the last 5-10 years, steroid users' awareness of health has increased. But in that, so has dismissal of certain areas. Most steroid users, Jim mentioned gonadism. Most steroid users accept the fact that their natural hormone systems are going to be absolutely trashed and they're never going to work again as just par for the course. It's not even regarded as a side or a harm. It's just what happens. It is a very casual approach to that. And you discussed that hormone breakdown outside of the user community, and it's a serious thing. But within the user community, it's nothing. It is literally probably the least considered harm there is.
I've noticed that myself, that, the talk of, as you say, outside of the using community, if someone said you're going to be dependent on drugs for the rest of your life, people would be shocked and appalled and avoid that at all costs. But within the community, when I ask users, what harms do you potentially face? What are the risks of your use? Very rarely will they mention, I might be on TRT for the rest of my life. That's just normalized. It's an accepted harm within this community.
Many actually welcome it. And though we have had a growing awareness of health, again, that's created misinformation within the community. There is people that promote harm reduction and they are very elaborate with their terminologies, and they support it with a large amount of studies that actually mean nothing about what they're talking about. But people are impressed by this because it sounds sciencey. So if we bring the science community in on that to validate what's relevant and what's not, that enforces the self-promoting harm reduction that's already going on. But it also gives research areas of where they can see credible research that's actually going to impact the user community in a positive way.
Yeah,
you know, the areas that they need help with.
I've seen that myself. You know, present company excluded, of course, but there are the experts out there, the gurus, who talk the science, but you know, they have no training, no scientific or medical training, but they will pull up some abstracts because they don't even have access to the whole paper, and they will spout some big words, and people in the community will go, oh, they're an expert. And I will follow what they say. And I've seen quite concerning things like even moving beyond image and performance enhancing drug harm reduction into, I've seen these sort of experts advising people on diabetes and all sorts of things. They've got no training at all. There's a lot of room for harm being caused by inappropriate, ineffective harm reduction.
Yeah, totally. Unfortunately, as well, now we see within the steroid user community a movement into other compounds. So more biohacking, stuff like neuropeptides and other peptides, and then into other aspects of health. We see drug usage actual trends where it's just trendy. So currently telesmartin is the drug of trend at the moment. That's what everybody's jumping onto because someone's recorded that it can reduce the risk to kidney function. But there are lots of contras involved with running an ARB, particularly if you don't have high blood pressure in the first place. So we see a lot of this. We see a lot of users jumping on bandwagons with trends. And this is where the integration of medical services, research and science, and the user, because the user community has a lot of knowledge and it has a lot of data. Unfortunately, it's raw, it's unkept, it's not collated in any way, but there is a huge resource of data there. But these trust bridges need to be built. And unfortunately, they're probably going to be built with carrots more than they're going to be built with sticks. And it's going to take a reach out in order to get that engagement to start moving.
Yeah, I think you're right there, and I've noticed it myself that it is a form of science that is being conducted in this community. It's not systematic, it's not well collated, as you said, but you get people who post the results of the testing of their gear and sharing information about the quality of their sources. You get people saying, I'm using this, this, and this, and here's my blood work. And they'll show you the evidence. There is this effort to have an evidence-based practice, but it is haphazard, and it is, you know, it's not done in the systematic way that we as academics do things. What we can do, as you said, is come together in this effort that we can help with the evaluation of the science. Some people that are evaluating the science in these communities don't have a clue what they're talking about and going off in wrong directions, which inadvertently, in their efforts to reduce harm, are going to cause harm. We need people who have a training in this area to help them interpret the science. So we've got that sort of making the bro science more scientific. But I think the other side of it is there is a lot of information in these communities that science could acknowledge and test perhaps in the future, so we can make the science more bro-scientific. So I think the relationship needs to go both ways, which I think might be the point that we need to end on. But I strongly encourage the community to get on board with this and the scientific community to get on board with this, and perhaps build a registry of users, those that are keen to see evidence-based practice and prepared to share the knowledge that they have, come together with the scientific community. I think it's the only way forward, really.
Thanks for a fascinating discussion. It was great listening to you both, and it really added something, I think, special to the evening. I'm very aware that I've said something nice about everyone so far. So moving along quickly, Dave, let's introduce Katinka. No, can I just say, when we talked about building bridges, Dave is one of the most generous people with his time and his expertise that I think I've ever come across. And it's really been a privilege to have him and other representatives from the community involved in the recent research that we've been involved in, which has given a whole extra dimension to it and a real massive increase in our understanding of what we're doing and what we want to do in the future. So thanks a lot for that, Dave.
Appreciate the comments.
Cheers. I didn't say you could talk though. If we could move on to Katinka now, and this is the final nice things that I'll say about people. Katinka, apart from being a wonderfully accomplished academic, is a force of nature, and is also very generous with their time, and really does help drag people along on a journey of discovery of research with their enthusiasm and commitment. So if I can hand over to you, Katinka.
Thank you so much for that very lovely introduction, Jim. I also want to say to the audience that we will have questions after my presentation. And it's also, by the way, really great to see that we have some of the same people who were attending the head panel yesterday also attending today. So great to see that you all are here. Anyway, I will better get started because time is going really fast. I will just talk a little bit about anabolic steroids and primary care. And it's actually, you know, just listening to Jeff, Dave, and Mair and Jim, a lot of the things that are being said about, you know, mistrust, the poor quality of information, you know, the focus on bloodborne virus prevention and so on, that those are things that I've, you know, been seeing in my research as well. So I will be talking a little bit about that. So I just want to give a little bit of, you know, context before I dive in a little bit more about the prevalence. But I mean, a lot of the things, you know, we'll come back to also what Jim said in the beginning, that there's a lot of weak evidence. But, you know, look, just having a little focus on, you know, the Australian context, we see that, you know, when we look at population studies, that the use of steroids for non-medical reason is, you know, basically relatively low. So, for example, the National Drug Strategy Household Survey shows that less than 1 in 100 aged 14 and above reported steroid use for non-medical purposes in 2016. I mean, we look internationally, we see similar figures ranging usually between, you know, 0.5 and 3%. But as Jim said, you know, there is issues with these, you know, prevalence studies as well, and the qualities of these studies are usually pretty weak. And of course, when we look at specific numbers, if we look at specific populations, you know, high risk environments such as bodybuilding gyms, we of course see much higher, you know, prevalence figures. So, you know, one Australian study focused on male gym users showed that 51% was using steroids or other enhancement drugs. Of course, you know, this is very targeted and it doesn't give a good overview of the use in the general population. Having said that, though, you know, there are indicators that steroids and other enhancement drugs is rapidly growing in Australia, also, but also in the UK and, you know, in other countries as well. And, you know, that it is indicating that this is a public health issue. So when we look, for example, at research focused on needle syringe programs, we see that steroid users are increasingly attending NSPs. And for example, the Australian Needle Syringe Program Survey National Data Report shows that there's a significant increase in steroid use as last injected over the period of 2010-2014, as you can see in this figure, being around 7%, and then but this is then followed by a small decline in 2019. Another indicator that often is pointed to is that steroids and other enhancement drugs are increasingly being confiscated at the Australian border. So where we had around 2,500 enhancement drugs detections in 2009-2010, this went up to like around 10,000 in 2012-2013, which then stayed around 6,000 detections at the years following that. So why provide healthcare to this group? Although it's a bit unclear about how many people are using non-prescribed steroids in Australia, research does show that that there's a need of help. That consumers are in need of help, and Dave and Jeff and Jim also all talked about this. But why should we provide healthcare to this group? And compared to, for example, other recreational drugs, the harms that come from steroid use are often less visible or less direct. So an example that I always use is, we don't see people using steroids overdosing on the street, for example. The fact that we don't see those direct harms necessarily, does that mean that we shouldn't help them? No, of course we should help them. And I mean, there are, of course, there's a lot of research coming out that, for example, shows that there's several physical and psychological health concerns associated with enhancement drugs. So looking at steroids, some of the concerns that are often mentioned are the increased risk of cardiovascular disease, cognitive deficiencies, and also steroid dependence. There's also research showing that many consumers who using steroids who want to stop often report having difficulty stopping on the long term. So of course, GPs and other healthcare professionals could therefore assist to ensure that people who want to stop are successful in this. And people using, steroids, needing, advice and information from medical sources on aspects such as health harms and side effects. Also, maybe around testing and to make sure that nothing is going on in relation to their use, as opposed to just obtaining information of peers, which currently is the main source of information. And as Mair and Dave also said, there's a lot of very good and helpful information also in relation to harm reduction, but there's also a lot of misinformation. So we need to build that bridge of having effective information via these peer groups, but also having information available via these medical sources. So, and Jeff talked about this a little bit as well, and I think Dave mentioned some of these things that I'm gonna talk about now. So what is currently the problem when it comes to providing primary care to steroid consumers? So when we look at it, on the one hand, it shows that GPs and other healthcare professionals report that there's a lack of knowledge on steroids and other enhancement drugs within the health workforce. Research also shows that GPs and other health professionals are unsure how to engage and support this drug using group. Adding to this is that in Australia, but I mean, this applies to a lot of other countries as well, is that there's very few specialists and also, specialized services that can support people who use steroids. And the problem is, one of the issues as well is that a lot of these specialists or these specialized services that do exist are generally housed within needle and syringe programs. But that there's a little bit of two issues with this. In one hand, it is research has shown that consumers often report not feeling comfortable attending these services as they're more so focused on other recreational drug users. And as both Jeff and Dave also highlighted, one of these issues within needle syringe programs is that they're often focused on bloodborne virus prevention, which of course makes sense. But the problem is that often other health needs that consumers have are therefore ignored. And as Dave also highlighted, a lot of consumers are not necessarily interested in getting information about BBV. So we really need to, have a more holistic service that provides information and health support in relation to these other needs that consumers have as well. And then on top of that, GPs and other healthcare professionals also report that there's a lack of harm reduction and education materials in Australia and internationally to upskill themselves. So when we look at the other side, so when we look at people who use steroids and other enhancement drugs, they often do not reveal their use to healthcare providers because they've experienced that they've been discriminated against, being stigmatized, healthcare professionals being judgmental about their use. They also have been declined care. So actually, in a recent health ed survey that I was part of when we were doing some research around steroids and primary care. So in this health ed survey, it was noted that after the 350 GPs and other healthcare professionals, 41% reported that they have ever declined to assist a patient who has asked for information or assistance who was currently using steroids. And 41%, that's a huge number. And also, many consumers feel that GPs and other health professionals are not able or lack the knowledge to help. And so this is also something that they've touched on, that often that when they disclose their use, the information that they receive, the quality of that information is pretty poor. So what do we have? The net result is a growing population of patients using non-prescribed steroids and other enhancement drugs with limited to no access to medical services and resources to support them with their health needs. So, but can GPs have a meaningful role in providing care and reducing harms from steroid use? Yes, they can. So Dr. Ben Yu and colleagues recently conducted the PUSH audit focused on collecting data on patients who use non-prescribed steroids and other enhancement drugs. So the data is not officially available yet, but Dr. Yu was so kind to already share the main findings with me. And the audit covered a range of topics, including, amongst others, experiences of GPs, what substances are being used, experienced side effects, motivations for use, and questions about post-cycle therapy. For this presentation, I'm just really quickly going to focus on 2 items that was part of this audit. So data was collected from 9 clinics across Australia, which in total included 308 audits, of which 207 audits related to non-prescribed steroid users. So what was also interesting to note, though, is that in this study, the average body mass index of people using steroids was reported to be 27.8, which is the same actually as the average Australian male, which is 28. So the researchers particularly highlighted this point as GPs and other healthcare professionals often think of the big muscular bodybuilder when it comes to steroids. But the patients actually that GPs saw in their clinic often did not necessarily fit this picture. So, for example, they also had a large group of older patients using these substances more so for anti-aging purposes as opposed to muscle enhancement. So their bodies were not necessarily very muscular or very toned. Anyway, so in this research, they asked the following 2 questions. They asked doctors asked whether they felt that they had effect in changing behavior, of which 77% said yes. And they were also asked what their effect was. So better monitoring of it. So more, a little bit more than 50% said that they had better monitoring of adverse effects. Half said treatment of adverse effects. There was also quite a large proportion that felt that they modified that consumers modified their use of steroids based on the advice that GPs provided. And as we saw here, only small percentages were supported in stopping their steroid use. But what this basically shows is that yes, GPs can have an important role in preventing steroid use or minimizing harms from using these substances when a patient is not ready to stop yet. So in an attempt to closing, this gap regarding the lack of knowledge and peaks in the health workforce and the lack of available harm reduction and educational materials, I, together with several colleagues, developed a GP guide to harm immunizations for patients using non-prescribed steroids and other enhancement drugs. So it covers aspects like red flags, background assessment, management tips, referral sources, information for health professionals and patients, and gives access also to several webinars. And having said this, though, we're not expecting that all GPs to be knowledgeable about steroids, because a lot of GPs will never, will encounter very, very few, patients that have issues with this. But the guide is there for those who do come in contact with patients who use steroids, so that it can help with improving their knowledge about these substances, and also ultimately improve their engagement with this drug using group. So although we do not expect all GPs to become, steroid specialists, or potentially could help in obtaining information about a patient's enhancement drug use, is opportunistic screening. So as part of a GP standard screening process, which includes questions about alcohol and other drug use, questions could also be included about steroid use and other enhancement drug use. So, and if a patient wonders why, why are you asking me this? A GP can simply say, I'm asking this because I want to ensure that I can assist you in the best possible way. And having this information, is important to make sure that I need to know this, because it potentially could impact your health or the health issues that you're currently experiencing. So, it really shows that, the GP is there to assist the health needs of the patients. And this is all, but this also then relates back to what I previously mentioned, that it's not, not all patients will have clear visual signs that they're using steroids. So asking questions as part of a standard assessment can therefore help reduce this, that certain patients groups are overlooked. Anyway, this guide is freely available on the Sydney North Health Network website. But this is just the beginning, and much more work needs to be done in this area. And, as Jim also showed in his presentation, a lot of information about, for example, how effective, programs on even this GP guide are, is lacking or missing or is weak. And I think, so we definitely, it's not only about developing these materials, it's talking about, evaluating how effective they are. A lot of these programs are also not developed with, any theory behind it. So, we need to incorporate stronger theory in the development of these materials. But I think also what is a point that is often overlooked. And although we involved both health professionals and consumers in both, setting up the design for this research project, but also in developing this guide, what we actually see is that consumers are often not involved in research, including when it comes to the development of harm reduction materials and programs. But this is very important to ensure that, materials are relevant. And I think one of the strongest arguments for this is that a lot of material that currently exists is focused on blood-borne virus prevention. And although, as Jeff said, although that is important, as Dave said, it is less of a concern within this group. So it is really important to focus on these other needs that consumers have. So when developing these materials, it's of course also very important to involve consumers in the development. Anyway, so thank you for listening, and we'll go back to opening up questions for the audience now.
Thanks for that, Katinka. And if I can just emphasize the really great resources that you've got on the Head Network website, we should check them out. We'll jump straight into the questions. We've had some through submitted questions. If we can have everyone there, brilliant. First question is around legislation. And we've got a great controlled experiment here. We've got the UK with a 25-year pilot of the one occasion when they've been quite adventurous with the Misuse of Drugs Act and not having a personal possession criminal offence, compared to Australia, who mentioned that very recently the development of significantly harsher sentences. The question is, has that in reality made any difference in Australia? It's our big fear in the UK that, and Dave made a great point around, be careful doing prevalence work, because rather than actually providing services, they might just change the law, which is at the back of everyone's mind. So for over to Australia, has it made a significant difference?
Well, I mean, the problem is that at the moment that there's not a lot of research around this. Having said that, though, one of the things that we do see is that since the change in the law is that consumers' arrest has increased significantly. So where we look at the illicit drug data report, you can see about, who is being arrested for crimes related to possession and supply. And we see that the vast majority are consumers and not suppliers. So that is one of the things that we've seen, after these laws have been implemented. But having said that, we don't know, there's no evidence currently about, okay, to what extent has it impacted in terms of on consumers gone more underground about their use, if there's any unintended negative consequences of the change in law. Having said that, though, we do see, when my experience when talking with healthcare professionals, and I think Mair talked about this a little bit as well, is that when talking to GPs, they are really worried about being able to provide care. So that's why we also, when we developed the GP guide, we specifically put a little note on top of it saying basically, if someone discloses this that they're using, you do not have to report this. This is something confidential between you and the patient, unless, the patient is bringing severe harm to themselves or others. But, we're talking here about, very severe criminal offenses. So in general, it's really important to know that GPs can provide care to this patient group without needing to report it anywhere else. So there are definitely, I do think it potentially hinders being able to provide care to this group. Mair, do you want to add to this?
I would agree. I don't think it's made any difference to prevalence of these about being used, but it does make a big difference to willingness to disclose drug use to health professionals. So if anything, it's increasing harm from my limited understanding of what's going on in Australia.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to chip in, or should I go to the next question?
You can go to the next question, but I just wanted to say, don't forget about Jay, because I think he was the first one to pose the question.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to next.
Okay, great.
And it's one that I'll sit out the answer to, because my answers are too sullied in some ways. Would love to know how our local area planning boards can commission and do more to think about harm reduction regarding iPad use, and what sort of services could be set up. Now, I've grown up with harm reduction services live within needle and syringe programs. It doesn't need to be that way. I suppose I'll sit this one out and from a clean slate, starting perhaps with you, Jeff. Where would you see an optimal place for services to be delivered from?
Well, I guess I find it really difficult because, like you, I think of it as the needle and syringe program model and all the kind of the issues that are associated with that. So looking outside of those sorts of settings certainly makes sense. But it's a bit of a cop out of an answer, but I just lean back on what Katinka was talking about just before we started this bit, and the idea of kind of co-production being so important. Actually, just talk to people. If it's in your area, find out what others want. What will be the best way to engage the local population with your sort of services? And I just think there's a real lack of research that actually looks at it from that perspective. There's lots of sort of research that talks about sort of barriers and facilitators of accessing services as they are at the moment. And I think a lot less about, if you started from that blank bit of paper, what would actually be the best ways to engage? So I realise I haven't answered the question, Jim, but maybe Dave could have more
fine.
to add.
Go on.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Yeah. What I wanted to add, in addition to what Jeff has said, to be honest, it is very hard. And it is, especially, for example, with this GP guide that we developed, the local health district was only interested in supporting this if we could concretely say, this is a problem in your local area. So, and because the evidence is so weak, it's really hard to illustrate that point. So we, for example, had to go back to needle and syringe program data, because that was basically the only available data to show, hey, look, especially in New South Wales, because compared to the other states, New South Wales needle syringe program attendees are actually really high. We use that evidence to say, okay, see, there is a need and we need to develop something in this area. But that comes back to the point that I made initially about, it is really hard because we don't see direct harms to say, okay, we need funding for this to be able to do stuff in this area. So yeah, it doesn't really help to answer your question, but I mean, what I want to say is, yes, go sit down with people, people that are affected by this. So consumers, have a look at, data that is available in your, local areas, to show that there is a need to support this group. But yes, it is because it's pretty hard, because often, issues regarding about focus on other drugs gets preference when it comes to providing support for this group.
Maya, Dave, do either of you want to come in?
I can't help with funding. I'm afraid that is way out of my range, but I do think that NSPs and other services can utilize existing lines of communication that may not be within their service. So what I'm meaning by that is, there may be a local gym that has a very good working relationship with the local users. There may be a local individual who a lot of people look up to and see. It may even be a professional bodybuilder that lives in the area, and using them as a gateway to access the people that need service. And it's about bringing these, the three distinct sort of groups together a bit more, and using the resources that are already established in there to deliver a message from another service provider.
I would add that this recent push, this age of enlightenment, and the interest in evidence-based practice and evidence-based harm reduction and health monitoring is something that we can get on board with, and is a way into these communities, which are very hard to reach, is the provision of things like the community is currently providing for itself, like health monitoring services, like blood testing and things like that. I think that is the way that we start building these bridges.
We have a very time-sensitive opportunity at the moment, because unfortunately for the individuals involved, but fortunate for the work of harm reduction, there's been quite a few bodybuilders dropping dead just of late. And as a result, that has heightened awareness of health impact. And so the user community at the moment is very open and very primed for involvement and interaction around improving health.
I think that's a really good point, Dave, and it links in with a follow-on question in the chat from Nick about how we best off getting health information and relevant resources to individuals, and it ties in very much with what you just described, Dave. That linkage into the community has to be there. As academics or practitioners, we are there as guests of that community, and we need that introduction. And you're only as good as the service that you last provided. You have to provide that service and be true to the nature of harm reduction. And I think that you answered that question very well, Nick, about the need to work with that community. I think we've probably got time for squeezing one very quick one. COVID. What impacts COVID had? We've probably got a number of different answers. We go to you first, Katika, because I think you published on this issue.
Yes, I did, and I knew that you were going to go to me, so I quickly pulled up this paper just to make sure that that I'm saying it correctly.
When you take it to 3 decimal points, I know you're reading off your abstract.
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, no, but this was a large study on male, strength athletes who use non-prescribed steroids, and I will just keep it short because I also want to give room to other people to respond to this. But basically what this study showed was that the impact of the pandemic on the training and steroid use showed that there was a reduced training frequency, obviously, because, you know, less access to gyms and so on, and that steroid use was also reduced. But we also, one of the things that we looked at was mental health effects. And while we did detect some short-term effects on the mental health of people who use steroids, these didn't appear to be long-lasting. So that were very shortly summarized the findings of this study. So, you know, but I wonder, you know, someone like Dave, you probably have much more to say about this and what you've seen in the community regarding the impact of COVID.
Just a quick one from you, Dave.
Whoa, does that even exist?
Am I putting you on the spot?
I'll deal with the mental health very quickly first. I was actually taken aback by the number of users that were absolutely losing their minds over not being able to go to the gym. They did adapt. There was a whole homebrew market of homemade weights and scaffolding gyms making in back garden. Some of the stuff was ingenious, but there was a huge impact initially. A lot of people were really, really struggling with the inability to train, and therefore they felt the loss of their identities. That obviously rectified fairly quickly. Gyms didn't stay open, didn't stay closed for an overly prolonged period of time within the UK like it was in Australia. With regards usage, what most of the labs reported back to me was that sales was strong, but the demographic had changed. So they weren't selling as many drugs to the individual, but they were selling to more people. And what appeared to have happened was that people stepped down off cycle doses, but went into relatively high cruisers. And a lot of people that weren't on, went on, but onto a cruise format in an effort to retain muscle mass during the period in which they weren't training. So what they were saying was, we haven't lost business, but we are selling a lot of 1 and 2 vials as opposed to 6 and 8, which would be their normal average orders. And so a lot of labs were reporting very strong business, but it was just how that business was going about had changed quite substantially.
And if I can just get the last word on that, I know there's a paper coming out in the Harm Reduction Journal, which came with some of the similar findings. And I think it does emphasize that there are communities of users. It's not one size fits all. You've got a lot of people doing different things. I think we've sort of run out of time. And oh, I got the last word in. Can I thank everyone really for their contributions? I think it's been a really enjoyable session. And I will let Katinka get the last word in.
I also just want to thank the audience for the great questions they've been asking. And yeah, I was really also, happy that we could do 2 panels on enhancement drugs and steroids. So thank you everyone for attending, and also for the audience for listening.
And thank you to Maddie and Lucy for looking after us.
Yes.